Hi everyone, welcome to another episode of the Cheeky Natives. We have a very special guest tonight. Shailja Patel is an internationally acclaimed Kenyan poet, playwright, theatre artist, and political activist, author of the bestseller Migritude. Her poems have been translated into 17 languages. Born and raised in Nairobi, she lives in Kenya and is currently on a writing residency in Johannesburg. Welcome to the Cheeky Natives, Shailja. How are you?
I'm fabulous. I'm so excited to be here.
We are so excited to have you in the build-up to the Cheeky Native podcast of Migritude. We've just been reading your work, and this is the kind of work that is just so visceral that you cannot actually be unmoved by reading Migritude. And so we'll get back into it. So I was listening to a podcast of yours earlier, and the author said, the host said something so powerful. They said that in the most powerful moments, you said that in the most powerful moments of our lives, we seek out poetry. So I want to know, and I'm sure you've been asked this question a million times, but I'd never ever get over the explanation for why your book is called Migritude.
Migritude is a word I coined. I was searching for a word that would capture the idea of migrants with attitude and migrant attitudes. The concept of an entire global population of people who are migrants and who claim their migrant identity, not as a source of shame or as a source of disenfranchisement, but as the fullness of being global and all the histories of transcontinental migrations, and also entire populations of people of colour in the global north who refuse to assimilate in order to be safe, who refuse to erase where they came from but bring it into where they are. It also draws on the history of negritude.
I love this title and I love the story behind it, and I think it's very important that you coined the term yourself. It speaks to the act of reclaiming our experiences and naming them for ourselves without having anybody else's gaze coloring the ways in which we choose to speak about our experiences. You speak a lot about the unique experiences of migrants, and I've been thinking a lot about the model immigrant and how that sort of deprives immigrants all over the world of their ability to hold on to their own cultures and the act of assimilation. What do you think about the model immigrants and the ways that it's been portrayed all over the world, be it in the US, be it in the UK? Have you had your own experience of being a model immigrant?
I have, absolutely. And I fiercely resist the model migrant as a concept, as a demographic, and as a political category. Because in order to set up one group as the models, it means you always have to have the other group who are, the anti-model. And it's sort of like, it really draws on the Victorian notion of the good deserving poor and the bad undeserving poor. And so we have the good migrants, they're the ones with the graduate degrees, the doctors, the lawyers, or the ones who will work 12 hours for below minimum wages and never ask for anything and never protest their conditions. And then we have the bad migrants, the noisy ones, the ones who want to unionize and demonstrate and demand full rights. And it's a deeply insidious and oppressive idea.
It really is. And I love how you describe being a migrant in so many of your interviews as a precarious place to be. It's a place of precarity. And then you see people who are privileged react very differently to that. Do you want to just tell us a little bit about why you choose to describe it as a place of precarity? And also, more interestingly, the reactions you describe it so perfectly. I would be doing it an injustice to actually describe the reactions of people to the idea that they themselves could be migrants at some point in their lives.
Yes, I think that's one of the things that makes people so twitchy around the idea of migrant populations is being confronted with the reality that they could also be displaced, especially at this moment in the world's history when we're at a convergence of crises. We've just seen in Santa Barbara, one of the wealthiest communities in one of the wealthiest states in the US. I believe over 20 people have been killed by mudslides after tens of thousands of people were displaced by fires. So wealth does not protect you from displacement, social privilege and economic power, race privilege, none of those things protect you. And in the US right now, you have tent cities under the underpasses of major highways in every US city. You have huge populations of unhoused, displaced people. So that reality that all of us are really living on shifting ground at every moment, and at any time climate crisis could completely and fundamentally change the conditions of our lives, is something I think we really all have to come to terms with. And it's terrifying.
It is.
And so people want to create a distance between this is me, I'm secure, I'm stable, I'm moneyed, I'm professionalized, I've created safety for myself and my family, and that's those people out there, but I'm never going to be like them.
And it's that idea, right, that comforts people, that I'm never ever going to be like those people. And I think that comfort allows people to behave in almost inhumane ways because they believe that that's not a reality that is ever going to be theirs. And how do you believe that this idea that being a migrant could possibly be anyone's lived realities, how do you hope that as an activist that'll shape people's politics?
I hope that thinking of ourselves as potential migrants, as well as owning the histories of migration that all of us carry. I don't care how wealthy, secure, comfortable you are, you have a history of migration if you go back far enough. I hope it'll actually open all of us up to the realities of our shared planet. The Kenyan writer Kiguru Macharia talks about creating a livable, shareable world as a political ideal, the politics of livable, shareable worlds. It's not that, it's not a utopian ideal. It is perfectly, right here in South Africa, for example, there is such tremendous mineral wealth, there is such tremendous natural wealth. It's completely possible that everybody could have the basic conditions that allow for a good life, the infrastructures of opportunity, housing, welfare, sanitation, healthcare, education. All of those things are possible, they're fundable. We have the economic models, we have the technology to make it possible.
I've heard you speak about invisibility, and from reading Migritude, I felt that it addressed a lot of the invisibility that we have around migrants and people of color. How are you continuing to address, and in fact, so the question has two parts. Why was Migritude an important book for you to write in terms of the invisibility of women of color that are migrants, and how are you moving forward with addressing the invisibility of women around the world of color, particularly as our status is completely just under threat? I think that the lives of women of color are continuously under threat, be it in the situations in which we find ourselves navigating in our day-to-day lives, or even the greater systems that exist to hold women of color back. How do you feel that you are addressing sort of that invisibility, and why was it important to address it in Migritude particularly?
Well, Migritude began with a collection of saris that was passed down to me by my mother. And when I began to look into the history of these saris, they uncovered all these histories of colonialism that I didn't know, all these lives of women under empire that I hadn't been taught in school, and that I was outraged that I hadn't been taught in school, because it would have changed my worldview and how I moved through the world. So it was important for me that people see how empire impacted women, because the liberation stories that were also told of the freedom fights in Africa, in Asia, they've been so deeply masculinized. We have one or two women who are presented as exceptional women, the freedom fighters, the names we know. But the reality of how many women were a central part of liberation struggles, and that they existed in those liberation struggles differently because they were vulnerable to sexual violence, both from the colonizers and from their own comrades, most devastatingly. We're just beginning to hear the stories of the sexual violence that ANC women suffered in the training camps at the hands of their male comrades. it was incredibly important to me that those histories be available to future generations of women. Not just the histories of oppression and victimization, but the histories of women being a part of liberation struggles, the histories of women on the front lines. And even now, we see how easily women of the global south are silenced and erased from the most central struggles of our time. So Ruth Nyambura, a Kenyan ecofeminist, points out how women in the global south have been on the front lines of the struggles around climate change, the demands for climate reparations, and yet the leaders of the global movement around against climate crisis continue to be, white men and a couple of white women. They're the spokespeople. They're the ones who are, constantly looked to for comment and for leadership. But all the movements right here on the ground are erased. I just learned this week of the struggle on the Wild Coast, where an Australian mining company wants to mine titanium along 22 kilometres of the Wild Coast. And women are leading the resistance against that. And over 10 activists have been shot or poisoned in the last few months. So these are the women we need to be foregrounding and amplifying and naming as the global leaders that they are against the forces that want to kill us.
I love the suitcase of sorries, and reading Migritude, the suitcase of sorries, is such an integral part of the book and of the performance as well. There's a very interesting story behind the suitcase of sorries. What spurred you to use the suitcase of sorries, and where does it even come from?
My mother had been collecting saris for me since I was a child, waiting for me to give to me as my trousseau when I got married. Some years ago, she gave up on me getting married anytime soon, if ever. And she said, okay, it's time for you to take your saris. So I had this suitcase full of these exquisite saris that I was not using or wearing in my everyday life. There was no place for them in my life as an artist, as an activist. And I thought, I need to use this, and so I need to use these in some way. I need to do some kind of justice to this inheritance. So I began to investigate them, to look at them and talk about them with friends, invite friends to look at them, and the stories that started to unfold from these saris and the histories they started to tell me about where they came from and how they came into being was the genesis of Migritude.
As women of color, we often feel, it almost feels like a noose around your neck, all the structures which exist, all the ideals of what a black woman should be, of what a brown woman should be, even just coming from our own families. And I think it's such a powerful part of reclaiming ourselves and our identities, to be able to powerfully proclaim that this is who I am. This may not fall into the structures of who you want me to be, but this is boldly who I am. And I got a lot of that sense from Migritude, which was just beautiful for me as a woman of color to read. In your interview with Emmanuel, you discuss the point of words, and you say there's a pointlessness of words, and I wonder if you felt that sort of extended into art. So if there's a pointlessness to words, why do you continue to write? Why do you write?
Wow. Now that's a big question. I'm reading Adrienne Rich at the moment on poetry and commitment, and she returns constantly to this idea of what work does the work do? And that's very central for me as a writer, that it's not enough to just put beauty out into the world, or good writing out into the world that entertains and that gives pleasure, although those are nice things. I'm not anti-pleasure in any way. But for me, it's always important to ask, what work do these words do? How are they actually going to move us forward towards a livable, shareable world? How are they actually going to dismantle structures of oppression or contribute to the struggles for the world I want to live in? And it is important in that inquiry to sometimes acknowledge that words have limitations, that sometimes words cannot achieve anything in a given situation, and that we have to draw on all the other tools that are available to us, the tools of actual physical struggle, the tools of analysis, the tools of movement building.
So, and with that being said, there's a commitment to, you speak about it in a lot of the interviews that you've done, about a commitment to good art. And that's just something I've been grappling with. There's been lots of art has been produced at really, really great rates because we're such a consumer society, and artists are being pushed to produce great volumes of work in very, very short amounts of time. What does it mean to produce good art that is not just driven by political ideals? And leading on to that also is, how do you then merge your lived experience with your politics? How do you make those two meet in ways that are viable and that are real and that are true to self, but are also in keeping with the ideals of the world that you'd like to see?
Well, taking the first part of your question, when you say produce good art that is not just driven by political ideals, for me, at the center of good art is political ideals. I'm not interested in work that doesn't have a viewpoint, that doesn't present me with a clear sense of where does this person stand in relation to the world. So the politics of the work is always very important to me. The second part of your question, I've now forgotten the second part of your question. Can you rephrase it for me?
So I just wanted to know how you merge your political ideals with your lived experience. I think that's a question that a lot of young women are battling with, particularly cis-het women, because you have the politics of wanting to be feminist and wanting to be radical, but also then interacting with men and all these other people whose politics might be violent to you. So I'm just curious as to how you've navigated those kind of worlds.
I don't think there's a formula. I think on a daily basis, we swim in waters that are hostile to us. Let's start with capitalism. Capitalism is the water that we swim in, and it is also the toxic water that is destroying us. I don't think we should idealize queerness. Queerness in itself is not a revolution. It's simply another form of desire, another way of being in the world, another way of interrogating gender and sexuality. But queer relationships can be every bit as oppressive, every bit as abusive, every bit as violent as patriarchal relationships. So the question is always, what is the quality of the interaction we're in? What are the power balances and the dynamics of the spaces that we're in, of the relationships that we're in, of the institutions and the work we're doing? And how do we name them? How do we articulate them? And then how do we negotiate them and figure out the best conditions for our own survival?
I'm very curious about this. You began your career first as an economist, and then you became an accountant. Describe that journey. How do you go from being an economist and an accountant to being a poet and playwright and author of Migritude? It feels like such a big sort of jump, such a big leap. And how did you make that leap?
Well, to me, the connecting thread is, first, survival is a big part of it. I'd wanted to be a writer from my earliest childhood. It wasn't a serious career possibility or a livelihood that was available to me as a young woman growing up in Kenya. So I did my degree in politics and economics, and then I had to begin earning right away. The imperative was on me to start earning for my family because I was required to educate my younger sister and put her through college. So there was never any question of doing anything else. I knew from very young, from about the age of 8 years old, I was told it's your job to educate your sister. And so that was really my driving force until, from the point where I graduated from university and then went into chartered accountancy with a big corporate firm in London, because that was the only way I could get a work permit to stay in the UK and to earn in pounds sterling, which was necessary to pay my sister's college fees. That world was incredibly hostile to me. It was a straight white boys club. It was riddled with racism, misogyny, homophobia, and coming up against the real evil of these corporate systems was really painful. So, for example, I would be auditing clients who paid their women employees less than they paid their male employees, just as a matter of course. It was illegal to do that, it was immoral to do that, but they did it. And I was looking at this and I was saying to them, you cannot do this, this is illegal. And they weren't going to do anything about it.
And so my friend and I were talking about that. Cloak and I always talk about reclaiming words that are used to sort of disparage women. Recently someone said to me, oh, Alma, this was a senior medical male registrar at work. He was like, oh, this intern describing me, she's just too opinionated. She's just so loud. I don't like her. I turned around and I was like, thank you. Black women have not been allowed to be loud or opinionated for a very long time. And to use words like loud and opinionated as insults for black women is actually so last century. We are reclaiming these words. And I felt a lot of that in Migritude, that it was a reclamation of our identities and a reclamation of all the things that have been said about women of color, almost to disparage us for just being true to ourselves. That was quite an aside. I actually wanted to have a conversation about assimilation and cultural appropriation. You have a poem in which you describe how your father is able to speak 5 languages and is yet humbled by English as a language. And it made me think of all the ways in which we use English as a weapon, or English is used as a weapon against people of color. What are your current feelings about assimilation and cultural appropriation, which constantly comes up?
Assimilation and cultural appropriation. Those are two very different. Those are two different questions, and we started with the weaponization of English. So I'm going to start with the first one, the weaponization of English. A conversation I'm constantly having in Kenya is about the ways in which English is used to what's the word I want, to act out class insecurity. So if you have had an elite education which teaches you to speak what you think is proper English, then you assert your class status by mocking or demeaning people who speak other Englishes. And that position is both ahistoric and oppressive, because there is no single thing called standard English. There is no proper English. English itself is an incredibly hybridized, polyglot language that is borrowed and stolen from every other language in the world. And so this idea of English as a signifier of class superiority or of socioeconomic status is particularly ridiculous when we who have been colonized peoples and who have had English deployed against us as a weapon of exclusion and as an oppressive structure start then replicating that structure of oppression against people who haven't had the access to formal education that we have. Talking about cultural appropriation, for me the issue is not who gets to tell which stories, it's who gets heard when they tell the stories. You know, there's this sort of idea that those of us who speak about cultural appropriation are trying to police the imagination of other artists and writers. We're trying to restrict who can say what, who can write about what. The most graphic illustration to me of what we mean when we talk about cultural appropriation is an image that I have seen, a meme that went out, that's been out for about several years now, where the first panel is a photo of young white American children dressed up as Red Indians, in inverted commas, wearing Native American costumes and playing games impersonating Native Americans. And the caption is, "It was okay for these children to be Indians." The next panel is a photo of Native American children who had been kidnapped from their families and put in the residential schools that was set up all over North America, where literally hundreds of thousands of Native American children were stolen from their communities, from their families, put in these incredibly oppressive schools that were really little more than jails. Many of them died of malnutrition, of illness. Their hair was cut, they weren't allowed to speak their languages, they weren't allowed to express any part of their culture, and they were viciously punished if they did. And it was not okay for those children, real Native Americans, to be Native Americans. And that's what we mean when we talk about cultural appropriation. When it is okay for a colonizing class or for those who have race privilege in society to take a part of another culture, perform that culture, enjoy that culture, act out that culture, and be rewarded for it, be paid for it, to commodify that culture and actually reap benefits from it. But the people to whom that culture belongs, when they express their culture, they actually suffer for it. It's either forbidden to them, and for a long time it was actually forbidden. It wasn't. There are some states in the US where it wasn't until the 1970s that laws were revoked that banned Native Americans from performing their own religious rituals and their own spiritual ceremonies. But meanwhile, white Americans all over America had appropriated these ceremonies and were performing them and were making money out of running sweatshop weekends and, native and saging and, doing all these rituals that they had stolen from Native Americans. And we can see that on every continent on the planet, in every situation. And we can also see it, it's not even always about race. If you look at Bollywood, so if you examine film industries, Nollywood and Bollywood, the South African film industry, it's really interesting to me to see how urban elites appropriate the cultures of rural people, whether it's their dances, their songs, their village cultures, their communities, and basically use them in their work without attributing and without sharing the benefits. So they will appropriate rituals of indigenous people and stories of indigenous people, both on the Asian and the African continent, commodify them, integrate, what they want out of those things, and at the same time erase these people.
And it speaks to that, right? And whenever I think of appropriation, I think of what someone said recently, that everybody wants to be a person of color until it's time to do the work of people of color. So it's cool to be black until you need to participate in Black Lives Matter, or until you need to speak about Marikana, until you need to... Everybody wants the idea of participating in African culture until it comes to paying respect to those cultures, or not exerting your cultural imperialism on those cultures. So when you come and want to culture-splain somebody else's culture to them, or come and want to be an expert on black people's lived experiences based on the few festivals or the few things that you've seen, that always feels like cultural appropriation to me. And I think that the manner in which people appropriate culture changes all the time. It's not static. I think that it's a lot like racism, in the fact that it's ever changing and it adapts to the situations in which it finds itself as well.
Yes, it's also, I want to add to that, because another form of cultural appropriation is biopiracy on the African continent. And we're seeing that on a massive scale, where you have pharmaceutical companies and tech companies literally harvesting native plants and species of this continent, and then making huge profits out of them. And right now, this very week, in Kenya, there has been a new assault in the state war on indigenous forest-dwelling people in the Embobot forest in Kenya, the Sengwer people, who have faced a long, several years of forced evictions, being burned out of their homes, facing the army coming in and trying to forcibly evict them from the forests that they have lived in for generations, that they have been the stewards of.
And the custodians of.
Yes, exactly. But those forests now have tremendous commercial value, and there are entire conglomerates, that have been formed to harvest not only the hardwoods of those forests, but also the species that only grow in those forests, that have tremendous, huge applications for pharmaceuticals and all kinds of other commercial applications. So what you have is a generation of Kenyans who are the ruling class, who are literally trying to exterminate indigenous forest-dwelling people in Kenya, so that they can appropriate their culture and claim, and basically profit off it. And we're seeing this going on all over the continent.
And it also just speaks to the evils of capitalism, because these are the same people who would come in, benefit from the forests and the plant species, and then not want to provide those pharmaceuticals back to the people of those lands, right? So when Big Pharma then wants to come back and sell those pharmaceuticals, those ARVs, those cancer drugs to the African continents at exorbitant prices, which will then render them out of reach for the average African citizen. Speaks to just the evils of capitalism, right? That you can sell something as basic as health and make it out of reach for even the person from whom you appropriated that very drug from.
Yeah, absolutely.
How do you keep from not, the battle is large and ever growing, and there are new assaults every day on the womanhood and the identities of people of color all over the world. As an activist, how do you keep from not becoming hopeless or fatigued at the idea of just how much fight we have left for us?
Well, first of all, I think it's important to embrace both fatigue and hopelessness. I'm very suspicious of hope. I think hope is often sold to us as a form of mental Viagra, to create this artificial inflation of energy to force us to deny the truth that we know. I think if there's ever been a time to really examine how little room there is for hope, at this moment in history, the truth of where we are as a species, the truth of where we are on this planet, the extremity of what's facing us, that moment is now. And I don't have a problem with feeling hopeless. I think in the space of hopelessness, in the space of fatigue and retreat, that's when we also discover profound truths about our limitations as a species, as living beings on this planet among millions of other living beings. I think it's also important to look at the commodification of hope and the ways that it serves the interests of capitalism. There's a way in which we are encouraged to be, you gotta have hope, you gotta have hope, you gotta
just
have
keep
hope,
hoping it'll get better,
so that you then block out everything that threatens your hope, which is exactly what global capitalism wants, which is exactly what global militarism wants. It wants to sell us hope as a drug, so that we don't look at the truth of what we're up against.
What are some of the truths that you've encountered with regards to your limitations? Just as a person, just as people, what do you think are the limitations that exist with regards to the work that needs to be done?
Well, I think one of the first truths that I think it's important for us, for culture makers, for artists, for writers to acknowledge is that art by itself is not revolutionary. No matter how powerful it is, no matter how strongly grounded in a politics of revolution it is, we know that some of the men who have written, the most revolutionary texts in the world, let's take Karl Marx, for example, have also been absolute shitholes to their wives, to their children, to the women in their lives, have perpetuated tremendously oppressive conditions, the very conditions they were arguing against in their work. We see over and over again in revolutionary movements like Fees Must Fall that structures of oppression, of violence against women, of class violence, of all these other things are replicating themselves in those movements. So to me, yes, the work is important. Yes, it is important to have knowledge put out into the world, to produce knowledge, and we need that knowledge. It is also crucial and critical that we interrogate the actual behavior of the people producing that knowledge, and that we look at ourselves as well, because for so long we've had this this sort of, what's the word I want? We've let ourselves off the hook for being decent human beings because we're doing good work that gets applauded out in the world, and that we believe the messages we're given that, you know, your work is so important that it's okay if you're trampling over people while you're doing the work. It's okay if you know, forgot to pay everyone in your organization living wages. It's okay if you were, you know, using interns who were unpaid. It's okay if your work is, you know, let's look at people who are presented as icons globally of, you know, of hope. Yet they're making money off product lines that are manufactured in sweatshops in Haiti. Or they are employing labor at below minimum wages, or they are boosting empire by being at the White House and by endorsing a politics of global domination. So I think it's really important that we continue to ask those questions, and we continue to acknowledge that by itself, the production of knowledge, the production of great art is not going to fundamentally change structures of oppression unless those of us who are making that work are also constantly holding ourselves accountable for how we live our daily lives.
And also just the act of interrogation, and not just interrogating ourselves, but also, I mean, when I was reading Migritude, I felt that there was a lot of interrogation of just the history and the things that people have been taught. I know you're going to read history lesson later, but I loved how you spoke about the Mau Mau uprising and the ways in which even people who look like us, people of color who are meant to be sort of preserving our histories, can also behave in ways that are ahistorical and also revisionist. You speak a lot about the legacy of the Mau Mau. What I'm curious as to what it looks like to you to honor the legacy of the Mau Mau as a Kenyan woman, and also how do you believe that people will begin to have a reclamation or an acknowledgement of what is really an important chapter in Kenya's history that has, for some reason, been completely sort of erased by the powers that cease to be?
Well, the politics of genuine liberation in Kenya are an ongoing struggle. We have at the moment a regime in power that is resolutely opposed to any form of redistribution, any form of economic justice. Their purpose in holding office is to retain and consolidate a hegemonic power over Kenya's wealth, and particularly over land ownership and resource ownership in Kenya. So we're in a position of real gridlock, I have to say. And what we're seeing across Kenya is that there are ongoing wars, little civil wars across the country, where the state is daily making war on indigenous people in the forests, on indigenous people, on pastoralists in northeastern province, on the communities that owned the plateaus of Laikipia and central Kenya, on the communities living in informal settlements in the big cities. It's a state of ongoing war, really, across the country, and people are fighting for their survival when they have exhausted every means of peaceful protest. We've exhausted an attempt to bring about change through elections because we've had successive stolen elections. We've exhausted the judicial option because we went to the Supreme Court twice and the state eventually intimidated and co-opted the Supreme Court. So we're at the point where really, sadly, it's hard to see how we're going to achieve any kind of significant change except through armed revolution.
So you are third generation Kenyan, and you describe yourself, you reject the title of East African Asian, correct me if I'm wrong, East African Asian, which I thought was very interesting. And at the end of Migritude, which I implore everybody to get, you have a timeline. Why was it important for you to have a timeline? And following up on that, why do you reject the title of East African Asian?
Well, I'll start with the last part first. I haven't rejected East African Asian so much as, with all titles, it's important for me to identify where it's useful and where it's not. So I think we are all given many, many labels wherever we go, in whatever spaces we're in. And it's really important to ask who's doing the labeling and what's their agenda when they label me. So when I am outside the African continent, when I'm outside Kenya, I'm quite happy to be called an East African Asian, because that maybe opens people up to histories of the African continent that they're not aware of. When I'm on the African continent and I'm labeled Asian, it's an othering, and it's very often a political weapon to say, shut up and stay in your lane. Who do you think you are to comment on the politics on the national on our national politics or on our continental politics? So labels have their limitations, and it's important for us to look at the labeling in any particular context. The first part of the question, why is it important? Why was the timeline important in Migritude? What comes to mind is Lebo Mashile's incredible TED talk on history, and on the importance of claiming and owning and studying and passing on our histories. It's a goosebump inducing TED talk. I urge everybody to listen to it who hasn't already.
And listen to the Cheeky Natives podcast with Lebu.
Yes,
actually.
Absolutely.
She's brilliant.
Yeah, she's amazing. But yeah, when we erase our histories, we're stunting ourselves, and the history of transcontinental migrations between Asia and Africa goes back 5,000 years. It's important for us to understand that, so that we can reject the ways in which colonialism pitted us against each other. We can reject the artificial racial categories and the segregation that colonialism imposed on us. Right here in South Africa, I'm just beginning to discover the histories of migration here. Like, I didn't know until just this last year I learned that that Malay slaves were brought to the Cape in the 1700s. And that the first populations and that Afrikaans was actually a slave language that was created by the melding of indigenous languages and the languages of the slave labor that was brought here, and then the languages of the Dutch slave owners and colonizers. And so just understanding the histories of where we come from, the histories particularly of globalization and of migration, shows up the ideology of borders and the ideologies of nationalism as the fiction that they are. Nationalism is ahistoric. Borders were created to preserve military power, monarchical power, and now to protect capital. They make no sense whatsoever on the African continent or anywhere in the world. They serve to basically keep labor oppressed.
With regards to racial tensions, how are you straddling these? I mean, you've just spoken about it earlier, how people often want to use the label of East African Asian in order to sort of silence you and to sort of restrict you from having opinions with regards to Kenyan politics, for example. How are you straddling the very obvious racial tensions that exist as a brown woman in Kenya, not just in Kenya, but just all over the world as a brown woman, and the obvious racial tensions that exist because of the ways in which I think that oppression is set up to pit us against each other, be it the model migrants where where African immigrants are now being pitted against the African Americans in the US, and even back in Kenya, how are you straddling those various identities?
I wish I had a simple answer to that. Again, it's a daily negotiation. It's an ongoing struggle. And I come back over and over again to June Jordan, who said, I despair of identity politics because equality, justice are what you do, not what you are. And I will call you my brother, I will call you my sister, based on what you do for freedom, what you do for equality, what you do for justice, not who you are.
You've spoken about human rights as a meritocracy.
As not a meritocracy.
Sorry. As not a meritocracy. What do you mean by that idea that human rights are not a meritocracy?
What I mean by that is you don't have to do anything to deserve human rights. You don't have to be exceptional, educated, useful, employable, likable. You don't even have to be a decent person. You can be the most vile human being on the planet, and you are still entitled to basic human rights. And I first put that statement out when Trump imposed the Muslim ban.
Yes.
And people were posting all these stories of exceptional migrants, people who were geniuses and, had saved lives and run into burning buildings. And this idea that you have to earn just fundamental human rights is a crazy idea. Because it's also a form of eugenics.
Yes.
It really feeds into this very toxic idea of who is deserving and who is not. If we say that, only migrants who can run into burning buildings and save lives are worthy of being allowed in any society, what does that say about people with disabilities? What does that say about, people who don't have extraordinary capacities? It's also deeply classist because, as Ara Armani posted on Facebook, we need to honor the hair braiders, the cleaners, the housekeepers, every bit as much as we honor the doctors, the lawyers, the engineers. There are millions of people who do daily menial labor that is essential to keep our societies going. And quite honestly, if we have to choose between sanitation workers and college professors, I would happily, ditch the college professors and take the sanitation workers in any society.
But it's also just that buying into capitalist ideas, right? That people are not worthy of basic dignity and basic human rights unless they behave in ways which we can fundamentally commodify and which we can place a price tag on. So unless you are a doctor, or unless you have some wonderful story to tell of how you've overcome all of the structural limitations that have been placed in your path, you are not worthy of the right to unionize. You're not worthy of basic living ideals. And I think that's even propagated in South Africa as well, how nobody could understand why miners in Marikana were fighting for basic 12,000 rand a month, considering what these people put their bodies through is menial, it's meager. But because they are not educated, because they don't occupy the strata in which we think allows them to be commodified, people were uncomfortable with the idea that these people would protest for basic living wages. And it just speaks to the evils of capitalism and how we just commodify basic things like sanitation or living arrangements, or the idea that you are shocked by people in a township protesting to have access to electricity.
Absolutely. It also says that people are valuable based on their utility, not on their intrinsic
value as
humanity as living beings. Every human just has an intrinsic value that has nothing to do with. Still got sound?
Yes.
Okay.
So I just want to firstly thank you for agreeing to come to the Cheeky Natives and be on our podcast. The work that you do is immense. It is far-reaching, and we are so incredibly grateful that there are activists and that there are poets and playwrights who exist. I mean, the primary function of the Cheeky Natives is to archive the work of people of color all over the world, and there's something so powerful in the reclamation of our stories, in ways in which we write without the gaze of whiteness, and when we're not writing for an audience that expects us to tick certain boxes. And for me, Migritude was just such a powerful read. I've been going on and on to everybody about how you need to read Migritude, and I'm just curious as to what's next for Shailja. I know that you're here, you're an essay on a writing residency, but what's next? What's next for Shailja? What can we expect as fans?
I have learned not to talk about my work in progress because that deceives my brain into thinking that the work is done.
Okay.
So I'm trying to impose a discipline on myself, which is difficult, of not talking about the work until it's done. But thank you for the question.
We will stay tuned. We are eagerly awaiting whatever is next. We're sure that it's going to be brilliant, and not brilliant in the ways that Klok and I always talk about, how black girl magic and black girl excellence and all of these ideas of excellence, inverted commas, can also just be like an albatross around our necks, but in the idea that just by virtue of having written and archived the story of your life, that is excellence in itself. In a world which exists to continuously down, and to continuously shut out the voices of women of color in our stories, it is just a work of excellence for the fact that the work of Migritude exists. And we're sort of reclaiming excellence for ourselves. So I just want to say thank you once again for having come onto the Cheeky Natives. We're so incredibly grateful for the work of Migritude. We want to encourage everybody that's listening to the podcast to go and get the book. And I know they can get the book at Bridge Books, but where else can people come into contact with Migritude or order your work?
At this point, I'm sorry to say Migritude is not distributed in South Africa because my publisher, Kaya Press in the US, is a small independent press that doesn't have a distributor in South Africa. If there are distributors out here listening to this podcast who would like to distribute the book in South Africa, I would love to hear from them, and my publisher would love to hear from them.
All right, thank you so much to everybody. We're going to have a very special reading of some poems from Migritude that will follow to close off the podcast.
A reading from Migritude, share a couple of pieces from Migritude, and then we'll have the floor open for questions and thoughts, anything you want to share, and then we have books, which I'm happy to sign for you. So I'm going to start with a piece from Migritude that's called History Lesson. That's awake. So I'm going to stand for this. Can everybody hear me clearly? Good. I'm so happy we don't have lots of background noise going on. That's great.
Just as you said that.
Some good urban background there. My Kindle is waking up slowly, so be patient. Here we go. Okay, this piece is called History Lesson. Less than 20 years before I was born, there was a gulag in my country. I knew nothing of it until 2006. I've just realized that we have children present, and I should give you a content warning on this. This piece includes some graphic descriptions of rape and torture, unfortunately. I'm so sorry, it didn't occur to me to... Thank you. Now I feel really horrible about exaggerating. It's okay. Less than 20 years before I was born, there was a gulag in my country. I knew nothing of it until 2006. This is the history I learned in school. Standard 3 to Standard 5, Hospital Hill Primary School, Nairobi. The first man and the first woman were Gikuyu and Mumbi. They gave birth to the 9 clans of the Gikuyu. The Mugwe was the leader who parted the waters long before Moses and led his people to freedom. Koitalel Arab Samoy predicted the coming of the white man and the railway, a long snake spitting fire. He led the Nandi people against the first British invaders. Wayaki Wahinga, paramount chief, went unarmed to a supposedly friendly meeting with the British officer, Purkis. He was killed. We scribbled Purkis Pigface into the margins of our textbooks. We burned with the righteous outrage of 9-year-olds. We sang about the Maji Maji uprising in Tanzania to the tune of Bonnie M's Rivers of Babylon. By the rivers of Rufiji to Mahenge Plateau, hey hey we'll win when we drive out the Germans. Maji Maji, sprinkle maize, millet and water, protect us from German guns. We're fighting for independence for our daughters and sons. Maji Maji. Maji Maji, where Africans went into battle against the German military, armed with spears, bows and arrows. They believed a magic brew of maize, millet, and water would provide bulletproof protection. They were slaughtered. We sang about Shaka the Zulu king to the tune of My Favourite Things. Shaka the Zulu, he was a great leader, fought with his impis with shields of 2 meters, short stabbing spears his men used to fight. That's how his army gained all of their might. This is the history we didn't learn. From 1952 to 1960, the people of Kenya mounted a fierce guerrilla struggle, the Mau Mau Uprising, to reclaim their land and freedom from the British. The British incarcerated, tortured, and murdered approximately 25,000 Kenyans, men, women, and children. More than 1 million Kenyans were detained for over 8 years in concentration camps, barbed wire villages where forced labour, starvation, torture, and murder were routine. This is the history we read in school. President Jomo Kenyatta's speech 10 months after Kenya's independence. Let this be the day on which all of us commit ourselves to erase from our minds all the hatreds and difficulties of those years which now belong to history. Let us agree we shall never refer to the past. Let us instead unite in all our utterances and activities in concern for the reconstruction of our country and the vitality of Kenya's future. This is the history we didn't read. Oral testimonies from women who survived the camps. The white officers had no shame. They would rape women in full view of everyone, swing women by the hair, put women in sacks, douse in paraffin, set alight. They burned us with cigarette butts, forced us to walk on hot coals. They put cayenne pepper and water in our vaginas, petrol and water in our vaginas, forced in with a bottle, pushed by a boot. You were forced to work, even if your children were sick. If you had a sick baby, you strapped it to your back while you worked. The home guards would beat you if you stopped to take care of it. You would finally bring the child around to check on it and find it was dead. You would start screaming in shock and anguish. The home guards would order the others to come and help you bury it. Every morning when the barracks were opened, the home guards would ask, "How many children have died?" They would be tied in bundles of 6 babies. Each of us would be ordered to take a bundle and bury it with the rest of the bodies in the graves. In April 1956, Britain's Sunday Post ran an interview with Catherine Warren Gash, the officer in charge of Committee Women's Camp. She said, "Confession and rehabilitation of the women in the camp is proving better than a course of beauty treatment. The women arrive sullen, sour, unpleasant, downright ugly. But after confession and rehabilitation, many of them become really pretty." We learned in school that we attained independence peacefully, without bloodshed. We were the model the rest of Africa was supposed to look to, a happy multiracial nation where whites, Asians, Africans all lived in harmony. In Kenya's War of Independence, fewer than 100 whites and over 25,000 Africans died. Half of the Africans who died were children under the age of 10. 60,000 white settlers lived in Kenya at independence in 1963. The new Kenyan government was required to take loans of £12.5 million from its ex-colonial master, the British government, to buy back stolen land from settlers who wished to leave.